Hi, my name is Lyle Grant. Thanks for being with me today, and thanks to Mark for organizing this meeting. I'm exploring a new technology that will hopefully enable us to save fossil fuels, so thanks for bearing with me. I'll have a lot of material to cover, so I'll get right to it. Thanks.
The main ideas I'll be covering today are that developed economies are a relic of an economic fossil fuel age, that it's necessary to alter our reinforcers to make a transition to a cultural age of less work, less consumption, and a higher standard of living. Altered reinforcers are the basis of bohemian countercultures, including Walden II, and these bohemian countercultures represent cultural variants that need to be encouraged and selected in a process of cultural selection as features of a sustainable future. There's many issues that I'm glossing over today because of the brevity of my talk, but I'm including a link here to a web page where some of those issues, side issues and debating points, are treated in greater detail in the literature. I'd like to begin with some history. On the screen are two steam engines invented in the 18th century. On the left, Thomas Newcomen's steam engine, invented in 1712, and on the right, James Watt's steam engine, invented in 1775. Watt's steam engine is widely considered the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Both of these machines were used to pump water out of coal mines, and they're characteristic of the way we use fossil fuel energy. We take fossil fuel energy, in this case coal, and burn it and turn it into either mechanical or electrical energy. Even modern computers do this. They take fossil fuel energy basically and turn it into useful electrical energy. The Watt engine on the right was 3 to 4 times more efficient than the Newcomen engine. Now you would think that its adoption would lessen the use of coal. This is not, though, what happened. When the Watt engine came along, it spurred the entire Industrial Revolution because of its greater fuel efficiency. Its greater fuel efficiency led to its adoption in machine shops and factories, and led to a cascading effects of technology that we even have today. Even many modern machines are descendants of Watt's steam engine. So the general issue here is what's called Jevons paradox. I've put it in somewhat simplified form for our present purposes, but it's something that really has to be considered. Moving to greater fuel efficiency does not necessarily save energy, and it can have precisely the opposite effect. In this case, Watt's greater efficiency of the Watt steam engine led to the entire Industrial Revolution, not to saving energy. Continuing with history, you're looking at a graph of gross domestic product per capita from 1800 to 2009. These data are from the United States in constant dollars. The other developed countries of the world have a similar pattern of increase. GDP is the total amount of economic activity in a country, the total amount of buying and selling. GDP is important because it goes lockstep with CO2 emissions and resource use. The expansions you can see in the graph are associated with full employment, and these are bad for CO2 emissions and resource use. Recessions, in contrast, entail less work and are good for reducing CO2 emissions and conserving natural resources. For example, in the far right of the graph shows the recession that began in 2008, which lessened GDP, lessened motor vehicle use and oil use, and lessened CO2 emissions as well. There was, of course, less work associated with all recessions. The most notable feature of this graph is the huge increase in gross domestic product per capita from 1800 to 2009, a 29.5 times increase. So all the increase is due to the Industrial Revolution, turning fossil fuels into useful mechanical and electrical energy, as I just mentioned. In contrast, John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, estimated that during the entire 4,000 years that ended in 1800, GDP had only doubled. This just shows how important, what a huge impact the Industrial Revolution had. The 29.5 times increase in GDP per capita has in lockstep increased our use of fossil fuels year by year. This has caused elevated atmospheric CO2, now at 385 parts per million and rising at about 2 parts per million per year. We've reached a point at which peak oil is near as well. Peak oil is the point of maximum production that cannot be exceeded. So we depend very much on oil, and we've reached a point where about half of the world's reserves of oil have been used up. Considering all this, what we have is a problem of overemployment. Too many people working too much, producing too much income, buying too many things that require fossil fuels for their production and use. In 1800, employment was essential in producing sufficient income for the average person's basic physical and health needs. But today, employment has reached a point of overproduction, environmental damage, and natural resource limits. For this reason, our economic system is a relic of a past age in which full-time employment was important for well-being. So we never hear about an overemployment problem, but we constantly hear or read about unemployment problems. One reason for this is that even in recessions and depressions, 75 to 90% of the people are working, but they do so on a full-time basis, not sharing the available work with people who have no work at all. Unemployment is a failure to share work, a failure of a system that offers only a choice between a 40-hour work week or no work at all. This issue has not always been neglected. In 1932, the U.S. Congress nearly passed work-sharing legislation that would have reduced the work week to 32 hours. Overlaid on top of the employment problem is a problem of income inequality. We have income inequality within the rich and poor of developed economies and between wealthy and poor countries. Today we have twice the per capita income that we had in 1968, but in 1968 the poverty rate was slightly less than it is today. Since 1968, increases in income have gone to the top 1% of those in the income scale. This is an environmental problem, a sustainability problem, because low-income earners are compelled to work in environmentally damaging jobs simply to obtain sufficient income for basic needs. With greater equality of income, lower-income earners can also reduce their work in favor of activities that do not require fossil fuels and exhaust natural resources. Income equality is central to solving the problems of sustainability. There are many different solutions to the problem of sustainability, and all the solutions are needed because the problem is so large. Examples include things like geographical localization, concentrating people in urban areas in order to minimize fossil fuel use due to transportation. Also, solar and wind technologies obviously are important. Al Gore and Bill McKibben have written books that survey the possible solutions. I'm going to restrict my coverage here today to the solution of work time reduction coupled with altering reinforcer effectiveness for non-work activities. These solutions really go together. You really need to reduce work time in order to reduce manufacturing, reduce consumption, but you can't, to fill that void, you need to interest people in other leisure time activities, or what are traditionally considered leisure time activities. This solution is a long-term solution, unlike, for example, improving energy efficiency, which really has problematic results in the long run. It's directly concerned with reducing consumption, but at the same time offering the promise of an improved standard of living, improving the quality of life, not the economic standard of living, but the overall standard of living. The drawback and the challenge of this solution is that it requires cultural reinvention, redesign of the culture from the ground up. It involves a transition from an economic age to a cultural age, which is a formidable challenge. There are several precedents for work time reduction. We consider it a radical proposal at times, but during the entire 19th century there was a reduction in the work week from 60 or 70 hours to our current level of about 40 due to the actions of labor unions during that time. In 1930, John Maynard Keynes wrote a paper called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, in which he envisioned, within 100 years, a 15-hour work week and a 3-hour work day. He based this on simply increases in productivity and the economic standard of living that would allow people to enjoy more leisure time. Kellogg, who founded his cereal company, instituted a 6-hour workday. Kellogg had an unhappy childhood and wished his workers to have more leisure time. Benjamin Klein Honeycutt has written a book about this. It's very interesting, and he views this experiment as largely successful. Walden too, of course, as you're familiar with, had a 4-hour workday. Rosnick and Weisbrot in 2006 did a study in which they found that the United States could meet their Kyoto commitments, several of their Kyoto commitments, simply by reducing the work week or the total work time so that the vacation levels were standardized at European levels. The French have done an ongoing experiment with the 35-hour work week that continues at this point. The sociologists Juliet Shore and Anders Hayden have each written books about the necessity of reducing the work week, reducing work time for environmental purposes explicitly. There are two reasons for reducing the work week: one to enjoy more leisure time, leisure activities, and the other to increase to make the world more sustainable. So both these benefits accrue from reductions in work time. In order to move toward a sustainable society, work time reduction needs to be coupled with altered reinforcer effectiveness. Certain activities need to be increased in terms of their reinforcing effectiveness. In the arts, music, philosophy, local spectator and participant sports, open source computing, conversation, sensual pleasures, social reinforcement. All these things are capable of inspiring passions. And that's important because you need strong motivation to compete with economic reinforcers, which are very powerful. Personal social reinforcers are also very important. Robert Putnam, in his book Bowling Alone, for example, has documented the way in which personal social reinforcers have declined in effectiveness over time, largely because they've lost out to economic reinforcers. There's been a reduced participation in community organizations and community engagement, and that's had a lot of unfortunate consequences. You need active disdain toward consumer culture. It's important that people come to distrust economic reinforcers and see them as a source of excess and regard them as something that's aversive. All these features, the arts, interest in the arts, importance of personal social reinforcers, and disdain for consumer culture are characteristic of low consumption bohemian countercultures. Bohemian countercultures have a long history. In their present form, they began in Paris in the 19th century and have continued up until the present day. Walden too can be considered one form of a bohemian counterculture, but one in which there's more economic stability than traditional bohemian countercultures. In bohemian countercultures, you find people who are very strongly committed to the arts, have disdain for consumer culture, regarded as bourgeois, and but it's difficult to live in these kind of cultures because they don't really have a sound economic basis. Skinner's contribution in Walden 2 was to provide a stable economic basis that would allow people to participate in an arts-based society. Behavior analysis has a unique conceptual perspective. Within economics, reinforcers are considered something that's constant. Money is a reinforcer. Other things are things that attract people, but there's no talk, no attention given to the fact that the reinforcers are modifiable in terms of their effectiveness. They can be changed. Behavior analysis really has something to contribute here in terms of this perspective that tastes can be modified, that reinforcer effectiveness can change over time, and we need to evolve a technology to do this. It in part involves a technology of generalization, which we've been moving toward as a discipline. There are obviously many challenges to cultural reinvention along the lines that I'm discussing. Cultural inertia is foremost among these, a kind of a catch-all category. Our entire economic system is geared for endless growth, and we're told, for example, that we have to be globally competitive. This amounts to a race to see who can exhaust the resources most quickly and heat up the planet fastest. There are other ways in which cultural inertia manifests itself. Our notion, for example, that having a more leisure society, an arts-based society, for example, it really flies in the face of the way in which we are used to tackling problems. We're used to working harder, implementing technology, all the sorts of things that are causing the problem, though. Cultural reinvention also requires that we revise our concept of what success is. Our current notion of success is, in many cases, accumulating the most income, wealth, and consumer products. Becomes a norm referenced criterion that ensures that 50% of the population will be unsuccessful. Defining success in relative economic terms means defining success in terms of the relative failure of other people. We need to alter our concept of success so it's based on less on social comparison and more on personal aesthetic standards and other standards. Did I read a good book today? Did I draw an interesting sketch today? Did I play beautiful music today? Did I have a beneficial impact on the people close to me? These aren't questions that we consider the pivoting points of success in our current society, but that they can be in a reinvented culture. These altered standards of success occur in bohemian communities where artistic achievement is prized and a pursuit of economic success is considered bourgeois. Another issue is consumption skills. The idea of consumption skills and skilled consumption comes from the work of Tibor Sitovsky, a Hungarian economist who took an interest in both psychology and sustainability. Like B.F. Skinner, he proposed an arts-centered culture as a means of conserving resources. He saw arts education as a key to ecological sustainability. The basic idea of skilled consumption is that reinforcers in the arts are very powerful, but only after a long and sometimes difficult period lasting years. Proficiency and fluency in music, painting, and reading serious literature occurs only after years of learning either through formal education or growing up in an artistic or literary family. Once a proficiency is attained, artistic and literary reinforcers are powerful and a source of infinite novelty. Seattle librarian Nancy Pearl, for example, speaks of skilled consumption of literary fiction as book lust, denoting the strong motivation. A problem is that most people in our culture don't learn the skills needed to create and appreciate art and literature, and this leaves them with impoverished consumption skills. Following the activities of celebrities, watching standard TV programs, and shopping are examples of unskilled consumption. The problem with these leisure time activities is that they're insufficiently reinforcing to compete with material consumption, so people with no consumption skills go on accumulating material goods rather than engaging in the arts. Sitovsky therefore became a strong advocate of arts education as a means of both enriching people's lives and curtailing the harmful environmental effects of consumption. Another problem is a problem with education and the lack of a sophisticated technology of acquired tastes. In animal research, for example, we pair a light flash with food delivery, and that's been the standard way of creating a conditioned reinforcer. And we haven't really progressed beyond that in animal research, at least, to understand how to pair reinforcers together to establish reinforcers and establish acquired tastes. In contrast, advertisers have a relatively sophisticated technology of altering reinforcer effectiveness, and they spend a lot of money on it to implement it, but this all goes to boost material consumption. It's interesting that behavior analysis itself is an acquired taste. It's similar to artistic reinforcers in that it requires a lot of time and energy and effort to acquire skills in behavior analysis, but you can see that as you do acquire skills, they become strong. The whole discipline becomes more strongly motivating. And so in that respect, I'll leave you to reflect upon how you became interested in behavior analysis, how it became an acquired taste for you, because in parallel, artistic reinforcers work in much the same way. In terms of general education, we know that aesthetic reinforcers are natural reinforcers for children. They enjoy coloring, drawing, music, but these incipient reinforcers are curtailed relatively early on as the curriculum quickly shifts to reinforcers, to establishing reinforcers that are beneficial to the growth economy. Income inequality is a problem for cultural reinvention, as is the lack of universal medical care in some countries. Universal medical care is important because if you're going to have a bohemian style arts-based society, you really do need a situation where people can pursue leisure time interests without having to worry about becoming ill. These medical systems are in place in Canada and Europe, and they're really pretty good. We're talking, the problem here is restricted to countries like the United States, that developed countries like the United States that lack these systems, and of course underdeveloped countries.
With that, I've run out of time pretty much today. Thanks for being with me.